I mean, Japantown in the housing element isn't a target for a lot of rezoning. In general, the housing element focuses on neighborhoods that on the west, the west side and Sunset and the Richmond, which haven't had a lot of development. But do you feel like there's opportunities to add a lot of people in Japantown while preserving, what we all love about the neighborhood, albeit one that was destroyed by our government?
Yeah, so I want to start out by saying that any thoughts that I share tonight should not be construed as representing the whole of Japantown. We're very complicated and very diverse, despite our very tiny footprint. Now, to JK's issue, Japantown is under incredible pressure, development pressure, because we're located along a major transit corridor, right? And we're also located in a well-resourced area. And that's areas based on health department metrics that have, good outcomes. So incredible pressure. And I will say, JK, that in the EIR, Japantown is, I guess you would say, hypothetically depicted as absorbing an incredible amount of housing, where if you look at the maps, it's up to 24 stories in Japantown, which would have a huge impact. Now, having said that, you can look at it in different ways, right? Some people are looking at it as, well, this is an opportunity to reimagine Japantown, I suppose. But for a community that's had a lot of trauma, specifically through urban planning ideas, there's also a feeling like we've seen this movie before, and there's a lot of concern, right, for gentrification. A lot of our businesses are hanging on by a thread, and the increase in popular property value is going to have an impact. So there's a lot of concern, and I frankly, we are depending on the integrity of the city of San Francisco to honor, right? To honor. So if you look at the housing element, right, all of the cultural districts have been designated as being these priority equity geographies, right? And they've committed to a community-led planning effort in terms of rezoning. And we're happy to hear that, because some engagement seems relevant. Seems relevant. So there's a lot of concern, but also, I suppose you could say, you can also look at it as an opportunity.
Great. One question that I get asked all the time is, we've entitled a lot of units that are sitting there, as Rachel mentioned earlier, whether it's for environmental issues out at the shipyard, whether it's economic issues at Schlag Lock, or and just stuff that's been now at Park Merced, stuff that was a huge fight like 10, 12 years ago, and everybody lined up to support or oppose these projects, and then they got approved ultimately, and nothing's happened. Not one spoonful of dirt has been turned over. I guess, and at the same time, we have rezoned the eastern neighborhoods. Scott was part of a lot of this. Rezone Market Octavia, rezone eastern neighborhoods, West Soma, Central Soma, Treasure Island, Trans Bay, Rincon Hill, and there has been a fair amount of housing built there, especially compared to the suburbs. And so I wanted to get into that a little bit and maybe start with Chris, the developer in the room. First of all, could you talk a little bit about kind of why all these projects are sitting there? I mean, you talk to lenders all the time about financing, development, and housing. Why aren't these things being built? And why does San Francisco have to bear? I mean, maybe this is a question for you and maybe for Scott. Like, why do we have to do? There's 440,000 units in the entire 9-county Bay Area under the RENA in the housing element goals, and we're really we're expected to do a lot of that. So if you could kind of get into that a little bit, Chris, and then maybe Scott.
Can I talk about the previous subject for just like 30 seconds?
Sure.
Thank you. So the question.
It works. Just hold
It works. The question about housing production is actually a math problem. And a lot of things about what we just talked about is a math problem. What Scott talked about is we have to build more housing. We have to. And we actually have to build market rate. We have to build workforce. We have to build affordable. We can't just build housing for poor people and rich people. And the real solution is exactly what Senator Wiener said. We just have to build a lot of housing, and we'll fix a lot of these issues. But at the same time, we have to deal with, we cannot do what we did in the 70s. We can't go bulldoze Japantown. We can't go bulldoze the Western Addition. We actually have to respect that. And when you're doing large-scale development, you have to figure out a way to embrace the community you're developing in and bring them back within the building and bring them back within the fabric of the community. One of the favorite things that I love about San Francisco is legacy business. When I first read about it, I hated it. And now I'm on the HBC, and it's the best thing known to man. That's actually what creates the fabric of our community. And we actually have to do more things like that, and that's what's going to allow these companies and these businesses and the people to stay here. SoMarts is a perfect example. SoMarts is an amazing organization keeping artists and their creativity alive in San Francisco. We need more places like that. The last thing I want to say before I go into housing production is like in 2012, 2014, our budget was $6 billion. We had like 12 to 14,000 employees. We just had a $14 billion budget in San Francisco with 32,000 employees, and we want to hire 4,000 more. We are going to hit the biggest budget while known to man next year. We have to figure that out. So now let's talk about housing production. So housing production is very interesting. It actually is a math problem, and I actually believe that between the federal, the state, and the cities, they're going to have to figure this out because its construction costs are incredibly expensive to build. It's not even about land values. Land has actually no value today. It's actually all about construction costs and how you're going to get it built and what it costs to finance. If anyone here looked for a mortgage last year, what was your rate? 7%. Last year. Yeah, last year you're 3.5. Today you're at 7.5, 8, right? It's going to get worse. It's the same issue to finance this, right? So it's all a math problem. And when you look at some of these areas that got rezoned and reapproved, by the way, when I was on the USS California, a nuclear-powered cruiser, and I ran nuclear power plants, in 1985, we were in port in Hunters Point. By the way, we did take all of our radioactive waste to Mare Island, just full disclosure. We did not pour it in the dirt like all those people did in the 50s and 60s. But the problem with the Hunters Point Bayview and Schleg Lock is where you look at where the market is today for rents, they don't have the rents of what it costs to build. It costs the same to build on Rincon Hill as it costs to build in Bayview. I mean, plus or minus 7%. It's not a big number. And going to Fernando about modular and mass timber will be in effect. It will change the world. It's 5 to 10 years out at best. I invested in a modular company. We're building 38 modular units starting next week in Jack London Square. But guess how hard it is to finance modular units? Because you actually have to convince a lender to give you money before you actually put a nail in it. Because you have to tell them, oh, I'm building this box over here. You can go look at it. They're like, I don't want to go look at it. My inspector wants to go look at the building we're building. So we're financing a 38-unit modular housing project. We had to do it with hard money, which means we're paying 11% interest to do that project. The good news is the duration is so short, and we're making a big bet that it's going to be great. But it's that innovation that's going to happen, right? So I agree. Modular, mass timber is going to be in effect. The labor unions have to buy into that. The carpenters have bought into that. The carpenters have fully bought into modular housing, and how can we do it? We have to bring in the rest of the unions to do that, because it's the only way we're going to build enough. So it's all about cost. I'm done now.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So that is a good segue into, everybody asks me all the time, what about all these empty office buildings downtown? I mean, there was a story in the Business Times yesterday about the old Federal Reserve building at 301 Battery Street. And the owner, this like New York guy who also owns the Seagram's building in Manhattan, said he's thinking about putting pickleball in there, which I was really psyched about. But what are we going to do with all these buildings? To what extent? I mean, I say fill some of them with artists, but to what extent? And what are the finances of historic preservation? I mean, so many of these buildings would be cool housing buildings, these little office buildings in Union Square. Scott, is there anything in Sacramento can do to help that make that happen?
Well, we did pass legislation this year to facilitate the conversion of commercial to residential or mixed use. It was AB 2011 and SB 6, two bills that we passed, which I think are going to have their biggest impact in areas with underutilized strip malls or office parks that don't make sense anymore, and so you can sort of redo them. With the high rises, a couple things. First of all, and Chris is going to be a lot more knowledgeable about this than I am, my understanding is that for a lot of these high-rise downtown buildings, the cost of converting them to residential would be very, very high. The plumbing has to be restructured and redone in a completely different way. There's a big difference between plumbing for one communal bathroom per floor versus every unit. So it's not, I'm not saying it's not possible, and different buildings will probably be more or less expensive, but it's not like an easy, straightforward thing. But the other sort of pitch I want to make about before let's say it's super affordable to convert every high-rise downtown to housing. The question is that a good idea? Is that a good idea in terms of the future of our economy in San Francisco? Anyone who tells you that they know today what work is going to look like in 5 or 7 years also has a bridge to sell you. No one knows. No one knows if in 5 years it's going to be 5 days a week back in the office, or it's going to be a three versus 2 hybrid, or no one knows. And so wouldn't it be tragic if we went and converted all these buildings, created all this housing, which is great, and then all of a sudden office bounces back. Everyone wants an office again. And then we have less office. And then what we saw before the pandemic, when it wasn't just nonprofits and small businesses that were getting pushed out. Startups were getting pushed out. Law firms were getting pushed out. Some of the very traditional downtown offices were getting pushed out because they could not afford the explosive commercial rates. And so if we reduce our commercial stock, we could be setting ourselves up for a real problem. And one of the hopes that I have with, I'm not ready to give up on downtown. It's a problem now. I'm also, some of the safety issues or workers not feeling safe going downtown was also part of it. But we have an opportunity, if commercial rents are going down, for some of those uses that got pushed out to come back. I want nonprofits to be able to say, oh my God, commercial rents are now 30% less than they were before the pandemic. I want to come back. Or some of the startups or the law firms. I want them to be able to find the place. If we start reducing the amount of office space, that will prop up commercial rents, and it may not benefit the community. So I think it's complicated. I just want to comment on one part of the last question about the RENA numbers and San Francisco having 82,000, and shouldn't that go somewhere else? If we were sitting here, if we teleported ourselves into Palo Alto and you got to observe a community meeting in Palo Alto, they'd be saying, why should we have thousands of units here? It's San Francisco that created all the damn jobs. They should be up in San Francisco. And so you hear all throughout the Bay Area, all through Southern California, cities saying, we have our 5 reasons, we have our list of reasons why we shouldn't have more housing or a higher RENA here. It should be over there. And we see that everywhere. And the reality is that San Francisco, like many cities in the Bay Area, has underbuilt housing for a very, very, very long time. Our RENA numbers were way too low. We weren't the only ones. There were a lot of cities that were way too low. You know, Mill Valley used to brag about meeting its RENA goal. Its RENA goal was 120 units over an 8-year period or something like that, right? Same with West Hollywood. They're all up and down the state. We see cities that had a RENA of 100 or 200, a small city, now have a RENA of 3,000 or 5,000, which for that city proportionally went up dramatically more than San Francisco. So this is a difficult time, difficult transition for everyone. It's a lot of tension, it's a lot of anxiety. And I don't like having tension and anxiety, but sometimes tension and anxiety is healthy because we have to do things differently on housing. The way we've done things in the last 50 years, where we said housing is like not the most important thing, and it's not a priority to build housing, other things are more important than that, that's driven the car into the ditch and gotten us to the point we are today. And so out of tension and anxiety will come, I believe, a better place.
So we're going to.
Yeah. All right. We're going to now get to some audience questions.
No.
All right. Perfect. All right. Hopefully, okay. Here we go. This is a long one. I said this is a long one.
That's a short one.
Oh, okay. I
Give you
didn't.
a short one.
Okay. All right. Here we go. The state's new crop of housing legislation attempts to increase our housing stock, but it's not focused on what we need the most. The RENA goal for San Francisco do include BMR units for low-income families, but none of the state legislation ameliorates the production of BMR units. Why is that?
We do need BMRs, but I disagree with the premise of that question. We've done a lot of work to facilitate the production of below market rate affordable housing. There was a bill that I authored, Senate Bill 35, the first bill I introduced as a new senator in 2017. There were some folks in San Francisco who fought that bill and thought that it was going to do horrible things. What it has done is dramatically accelerated the approval of thousands of affordable below market rate units in San Francisco. Bridge Housing, the largest affordable housing builder in California, has told us that because of SB 35, its average permit time has dropped for affordable housing has dropped from 7 years to 4 months, and so that is a significant. David Chu authored legislation to specifically streamline the approval for supportive housing for formerly homeless people. We're I think finally going to get it done after a few tries. Legislation to allow churches, other religious institutions, and nonprofit colleges to automatically be rezoned and approved to build 100% affordable housing. So we've done that. We have also, in the last few years, made historic investments at the state level in affordable housing. Is it enough? Do I want more? Of course I do. But unlike, I love Jerry Brown, amazing governor in a lot of ways. He was not a big fan of putting money into affordable housing, and we had to fight with him every year. This time with Governor Newsom, he starts out putting a bunch of money into the proposed budget for affordable housing, and then we build on it. We've done bonds, we've done new revenue sources, huge general fund allocations. Again, we need a lot more. We've also authorized the Bay Area to go out and do a regional funding measure for affordable housing. We passed that legislation. LA has now replicated that, which is great. We're trying to make it easier for cities to pass affordable housing bonds locally. We want to try to get that lowered from 2/3 to 55%. We've not gotten the support in the legislature to put that on the ballot. But so there has been a lot going on in the legislature to fund and make it easier to build below market rate housing. More to do, absolutely, but we are doing that work.
Which is fantastic. I do want to go back to the point I made before about what the goals that we've set for ourselves mean in terms of the amount of investment that we need to make. And I think the question was about BMRs. I posed it as both a public investment in BMRs and the private investment to actually make the market rate housing work. So I want to repeat that again. To meet those goals that we've set for ourselves, the city of San Francisco, needs to be investing $1.35 billion every year into affordable housing, and that's assuming that the federal and state are going to match that with tax credits and other funding. And the private side needs to be bringing in and feeling like there is actually a market for $4 billion a year worth of new private market rate housing. And that's the math that's going to meet that 10,000 units a year, 80,000 over the next 10 years. And that's what we're not seeing. So yes, we're seeing a lot of work that's inching towards that at the state level and locally when we pass our bonds, but we're nowhere near 1.35 billion, which means we're not going to meet those goals.
We have a question from the audience here.
You could introduce yourself.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'll walk over here since the cord is a little short. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm Gary Whitman. To introduce myself, I was the general counsel of the Council on Environment Quality in the Office of the President under Nixon, Ford, and then Associate Solicitor of the Interior Department under Carter, where I was in charge of all the Park Service lawyers, all the Fish and Wildlife Service lawyers, and some other environment lawyers. And I've been president of a couple of historic organizations here in this area, as some of you know, some of you are former members. So my question is going to get to what you were talking about, Senator, right at the beginning. The conflict between history and SB 35, the legislation. And I think this will get to the core of a problem that many history organizations throughout the state are facing. And if we could work out a solution, hooray, we're happy to do it and want to do it. So right now, SB 35, the principal legislation, recognizes one situation where the value of a historic property outweighs the value of housing built by the ministerial process, or what we sometimes call the ministerial fate. The legislation says that if a developer's proposal meets certain conditions, then the approval process is taken away from the city. The city would ordinarily have required an environment impact statement, and it would brought to bear the judgment of the citizens of the city, and there would have been some chance to illuminate the values that are involved, some of which are not necessarily more housing. And as you talked about before, we would like to see those historic values that you talked about, those historic places, fit into this system. Right now, Benicia Arsenal is in the middle of a situation which my question relates to. So SB 35 provides that if a structure on a historically significant site, such as a state or a federal register of historic places, is to be demolished, then that development proposal can drop out of the ministerial process of the takeover, taking away the rights of approval from the city. It can drop out of that ministerial process and return to the usual, more open permit process with environment impact reports and so on, in the situation where there's a structure to be demolished. But that's the only situation. What if the total historic value that would be lost and the listing of a historic property on the Register of Historic Places, either federal or state, will destroy trees, will destroy the setting of a house, of a historic house, a historic place, But the structure itself will not be destroyed. And this is a registered site, something of national importance, not just local importance, and not just state importance, something of national importance. Things that are on the register, the National Register of Historic Places. So assume this house where we're now sitting is in the middle of a block surrounded by 100, 150-year-old trees, and the entire block is a registered historic site. It's on the National Register, let's assume. If a development would remove those trees and closely surround this house, like 40 feet away, across a street, across an alley, surround this house with 5-story apartments, then the mandatory SB 35 ministerial approval would destroy the historic value of the house and the historic value of the site, the whole block, and the house itself. So that's what's happening now to the 170-year-old registered historic district on Benicia Arsenal. Destruction of trees followed by close-in construction of large-scale apartments may cause the delisting of this historic site. Historic value and financial value will both be lost. It's similar to taking property without compensation either to the public or to the house owner. The loss could be as great or much greater than the loss of demolishing a structure on a registered historic site. And if there were a structure, then the ministerial process could be avoided. But this greater loss will not, at this time, as the legislation is worded now, trigger that. So the house and site would be sacrificed, whereas a project that demolished a single structure on a historic site would avoid that ministerial fate. So one attorney has suggested that there was perhaps a drafting error when destruction of any structure, rather than destruction of significant historic value, was to trigger a release from the ministerial fate. So this leads to our question. This is the background. Would you consider amending Prop 35 so that it would protect significant historic values of the entire historic sites on state and national register in the same way you now protect those sites when there is a single structure to be demolished? That is, would you allow developments to be dropped from the ministerial fate and approved by the usual process, including environmental impact statements, when they demolish significant historic values on those sites? We'd be happy to work with you if you did want to do that.